2 years ago, on October 7th, Hamas launched an attack against Israel, which the Israelis say resulted in the deaths of 1,200 people and the abduction of 251 hostages. Israel's military responded by killing at least 66,000 Palestinians, according to Gaza's health authorities, and the demolition of Gaza causing massive displacement and starvation. But now the United States has presented a 20-point peace plan, the details of which are being negotiated in Egypt. We begin with this report from Adel El-Makrouki in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Egyptian and Qatari mediators have described the second day of the indirect talks between Hamas and Israel as reaching significant progress. They are negotiating the exchange of prisoners, Palestinian prisoners in Israel, for the Israeli hostages in Gaza. Hamas insists that Israel should take a step back, meaning making its troops to withdraw from the Palestinian enclave, at least partially, and ending all its aerial surveillance so that the armed resistance group can communicate with its teams on the ground who have the hostages and give them instructions to release them. The group says it's the efficient and most effective way to achieve that within a quick time frame. At the same time, there seems to be still crucial issues to be discussed throughout the next couple of days, like the disarmament of Hamas, which the Palestinian armed resistance group say it will only happen once a Palestinian state is achieved, and also that it is a matter of Palestinian negotiations, and it is only within that framework that should be discussed. At the same time, there has been some progress from the announcement of Hamas marking the second year anniversary of the October 7th events, where Hamas leader went in a speech saying that they're willing to hand over the governance of Gaza to a committee of independent Palestinians to take over the reconstruction of Gaza. That means that Hamas basically signals that it can let go its governance over Gaza, but it may be temporary only during the reconstruction period. It also signals that Hamas is maybe against having the international committee to monitor and manage the Palestinian enclave. In general, the talks seem to be picking up. There is a description of positive environment by the Egyptians about the talks being held here in the Egyptian resort city Sharm el-Sheikh. Wednesday is expected to see an intense round of talks as US mediators and Turkish mediators will be joining the talks, hopefully to reach the agreement by the end of the day or maybe by Thursday. All of this is just the first phase of President Donald Trump's 20-point ceasefire plan for Gaza. The entire plan and the entire process is yet to be discussed in future talks as well. This is Adel El-Makrouki for CGTN at Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt.
It's time now to bring in our panelists here in our studio. Omar Baddar is a political analyst from New York. Aaron Maté is host of Pushback with Aaron Maté on the Greyzone. And Dan Arbell is scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at American University. He joins us right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Dan Arbell, let me start with you. As we just heard from our reporter, the technical details of the first part of this agreement are now being worked out at that meeting in Egypt, and that involves the release of hostages as well as the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. Everything seems to be sitting on a timeline right now. Who does what first? Is it all going to be done at once, or is it going to be done piece by piece or step by step? But what is your sense of where this is going?
So I'd start by saying this is October 7th, and we are, the Israeli nation is in mourning. It's a very somber day in which we remember the victims of the horrific Hamas attack on Israel. And so start with that. And fast forward, we are seeing negotiations underway in Cairo, and one has to be hopeful, yet there's so many details in play, and therefore, remains to be seen whether Hamas will actually be willing to make necessary compromises, because it is required to disarm. There is talk about demilitarizing the Gaza Strip, basically removing Hamas from the equation. Once, how does all that align with the need to release Israeli hostages? Then, obviously the details, the technical details and more substantial details are being worked out as we speak. But one has to be cautiously optimistic and hopeful, yet things have shown in the past that negotiations can break down over petty issues or just issues that two sides are digging their heels in the sand or in the ground. So we have to wait and see where this leads us in the coming days.
Dan, of course, there are many parts to this agreement. There are 20 points in all, but we're looking at the first part of it, which is about the release of hostages and the withdrawal of Israeli troops. The American president, Donald Trump, he said this more than once, he remains optimistic that a deal will be done. But how invested is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in this? And given his track record, do you think he might find a way to scupper this deal and resume the onslaught on Gaza?
I think certainly Netanyahu would not have been at this point in the negotiations without serious pressure by Donald Trump. I think the only reason Netanyahu is in it right now is because of the Trump pressure, U.S. using its leverage on Israel, which I think is a good thing because something should have been done a long time ago. This plan was in the making for several months now, even during the Biden time. And what stopped it was, first of all, Netanyahu's refusal to move it forward. Now he's in a bind because he cannot say no to Trump. And hopefully, I think he's going to try and, maybe slow down or bring to perhaps, extend it perhaps. But certainly, as he wishes to remain in power, he doesn't want his coalition to collapse.
Yeah.
For political reasons. But I think that at a certain point, Donald Trump did not leave him any choice but to move forward. And that's why I'm optimistic, because we did not have such U.S. pressure on Netanyahu like this before.
Omar, one of the distinguishing features of this peace plan, this 20-point peace plan, is that one of the main parties, Hamas, had no say in this. It was left out of the negotiations. In fact, it was presented with a fait accompli here. But Hamas did come back and say, look, we are prepared to release the hostages as long as some of the other conditions in the plan will be fulfilled. It didn't say anything about other parts of the plan, the future of Gaza, what happens, etc. Strategically, was this a good move by Hamas?
You know, it's worth noting that it's not only Hamas that has been excluded, but Palestinians entirely have been excluded from this negotiations. This is an American-Israeli plan, first and foremost. And I practically am optimistic in the short term about the fact that we are going to get that initial release of hostages in exchange, by the way, for Palestinian hostages by the thousands who have been kidnapped by Israel without any charge or trial, who are rotting in Israeli prisons. But we don't, when we say the word hostages, we rarely talk about Palestinian hostages because we're conditioned to think of them as prisoners or whatever else. But the problem with the plan is about the long term. The short term part is indeed promising, and anybody should welcome a pause in this genocide. I mean, this has been 2 years of utter devastation of the civilian population in Gaza, deliberate starvation, deliberate killing of children, and the list of atrocities goes on. The problem with the long-term part of it is that it talks about the need to completely disarm and demilitarize Gaza, first putting it under the control of a so-called peace board run by Tony Blair and Donald Trump, two people whose list of crimes in the region is frankly endless. And then after that, it also gives Israel the ability to remain within a so-called security perimeter inside Gaza, not obligated to withdraw until they feel like it. There's no timeline for it. So all you're doing is essentially saying that Palestinians are going to remain living under the control of Israel, under the domination of the Israeli government, with no prospect of ever being a free people. And in that sense, while the short-term halt to the genocide would be welcome, in the long term, this is not really solving any problem, and it's going to put us back right in a situation that is ripe for conflict. And just one last quick point. Trump called on Netanyahu to immediately stop the bombing of Gaza. And since then, Netanyahu has killed more than 100 Palestinians throughout the Gaza Strip. The bombardment has not stopped. So this tension between Netanyahu and Trump is ongoing about whether Trump's words are going to mean anything when he calls on Israel to stop behaving the way it's behaving.
Right. Aaron Matei, good to see you, Aaron. Great to have you with us. Of course, there's a lot about this plan that we don't know. We don't know how it's going to be implemented, who's going to guarantee what. But what are your thoughts on the 20 points in the plan and whether anything can work here?
The most important point to me is that this is not a peace plan. This is an ultimatum for surrender, completing the goals of a long-standing U.S.-Israeli project to destroy Palestinian self-determination, which is the basis for the Israeli state, stealing Palestinians' land, putting them under military occupation, one of the most brutal, long-running occupations in the world, and denying them their basic rights. And after 2 years of genocide, this is Israel and the U.S. basically telling Palestinians it's time to surrender. The only vague nod to Palestinian self-determination comes in one clause of this plan, which says that we recognize Palestinian statehood and self-determination as the aspiration of the Palestinian people. Note that the document is not saying this is the Palestinians' right. It's only their aspiration. And if you're recognizing someone's aspiration, you're under no obligation to grant it. And the U.S. and Israel have been very clear that they will not. Marco Rubio has said that if Palestinians want a state, they have to negotiate with Israel. Well, what does Israel say about that? Benjamin Netanyahu says very clearly there will never be a Palestinian state. His so-called opposition, Benny Gantz, recently wrote in the New York Times that there's a national consensus inside Israel that there will be no Palestinian state. And even the Israeli leaders who were involved in the so-called peace process, they used those years of Oslo, the long negotiations over a peace deal, to prevent a Palestinian state by expanding the West Bank settlements that make a Palestinian state absolutely impossible. So overall, this is just an ultimatum for Palestinians after 2 years of genocide to surrender. And Hamas at this point, given the scale of suffering and devastation in Gaza, might have no choice but to accept it. But this should not be mistaken for any sort of peace deal. And let me say a word about October 7th, since it was mentioned before. If we valued all human life equally, we wouldn't just be mourning the Israeli civilians killed on October 7th. We'd be mourning the tens of thousands of Palestinians who have been killed in these last 2 years of genocide. But we don't value human life equally. And in fact, the premise of Israel is to deny Palestinians their equality as equal human beings. We're dealing with a Jewish supremacist state that does not see Palestinians as equal, and that is at the root of all problems here. Unless that is reversed, unless Israel can finally come around to acknowledging Palestinians' minimal right to self-determination, we're just going to have perpetual conflicts, not peace.
Dan Arbell, 2 years later, international pressures building on Israel right now. There is talk of sanctions. There is also talk of a sports boycott, a cultural boycott as well. And the kind of international pressure that Israel is coming under now is being compared to the pressure that was exerted on South Africa during the apartheid years. To what extent do you think, if at all, that kind of pressure is shaping some of the decisions being made by the Israeli government?
I think that certainly Israelis are noticing and are cognizant of the fact that there is growing isolation, that Israelis are facing difficulties in traveling when they just are chased in the streets of major European cities, or when they hear that the Eurovision Song Contest is aiming to exclude Israel, or UEFA may be disqualifying Israel from competition. Certainly that resonates with the Israeli public, yet Netanyahu is kind of adds to his defiance rather than accepting it, rather than making a correct course or change policy. He digs in even deeper. Even went as far as to state recently that we can become super Sparta and be reliant upon ourselves and establish an autarkic economy. So much so, this sense of us against the world is actually adding fuel to Netanyahu's rhetoric and political machine, and that's it's not causing it's not having the effect that one would anticipate or hope for. But I think that Israelis at home are watching this, and I believe that once elections are held, if they're held in the coming year, it will bring about a political change and a new government that would try and bring back Israel to the good graces of the international community, and have again Israel in a more seen in a more favorable light. Obviously, allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza, be at least more moderate in statements and actions. Hopefully, also withdraw IDF forces from Gaza. That would lead to a better feeling towards Israel around the world. But again, we're far from it at this point.
Omar, what kind of leverage does Hamas have in these negotiations right now? I mean, what real kind of negotiating room does it have? And would it be sensitive to the fact that there are many Arab states and Arab leaders who've also signed on to this plan?
There isn't much leverage really in the hands of Hamas. I mean, Hamas essentially is saying that we're going to continue making a problem until there is, a way to drive out the Israeli occupation. But beyond that, we've seen that Israel doesn't care about that anymore. It doesn't care about the hostages. It never cared about the hostages. Netanyahu specifically and his government, certainly there's huge protests within the Israeli public demanding the return of them. But at this point, once after 2 years, Hamas has made clear that they're willing to give up the hostages and reach some kind of reasonable agreement, and the Israeli government has basically disregarded that entirely and continued in an onslaught that is obviously designed to drive the population of Gaza out, to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And we're seeing the rampage not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank as well, of settlers rampaging, chanting death to Arabs. It's the most common chant you'll hear, burning down Palestinian towns and villages and homes, in many cases with the participation of the Israeli military. There is a full-on assault on the Palestinian population. So when we talk about negotiations, I don't think there's much leverage, which is precisely why we need that pressure to come from the outside, which is why that campaign of boycotts and sanctions is absolutely critical, because we are dealing with an Israeli population right now where public opinion is incredibly anti-Palestinian, where they see minimal isolation on the outside, diplomatic criticism from European governments and so on. They see that as a reason, precisely as Dan said, to become more defiant, and Netanyahu's using it to kind of like as a rallying cry about how the world is against us and we have to stand up and fight. But what you actually need is real, meaningful pressure that fundamentally changes the dynamic with Israel, where Israelis understand that you cannot have a normal society with a connection with the outside world. You can't have a functioning economy. You can't be part of the world as long as you are treating Palestinians like this and denying their humanity. And until we apply that kind of pressure, I'm afraid we're going to be stuck in an extremely ugly situation for a very, very long time.
Right. Aaron, it was just a few weeks ago when a number of Western countries, allies of Israel actually, said that they would recognize Palestinian statehood. That led to complaints from the Israelis saying that you are rewarding Hamas by going ahead with this recognition. But now we have Israel negotiating with Hamas on the future of Gaza. I mean, it's indirect negotiations. We don't know how far it's going to go. We don't know what it really means. But how big a shift is that?
Well, I don't think this is much of a shift in Israel's part. To the extent it's going along with negotiations, it's simply to placate President Trump, which is the main player that matters here. Trump, if he wanted to, could end the genocide. He could force Israel to allow in the aid it's been blocking. He could force Israel to accept, I think, Palestinian self-determination. That's how critical U.S. support is to the Israeli occupation. So to whatever extent Israel's going along now with Trump's plan, I think it's just performative. And I want to make a point here about leverage. Hamas's only real leverage is the captives. But the problem there is Israel has shown from the start it doesn't care about its own captives. Omar mentioned Israel repeatedly ignoring Hamas overtures, Hamas accepting repeated ceasefire plans that were then shifted to meet Israeli demands. And this begins on October 7th, when Israel's so contemptuous of its own people that it has to be pointed out, it wasn't just Palestinian militants who killed Israeli civilians on October 7th. It was Israeli forces as well. We know now from Israeli reporting and witnesses that Israel enacted the Hannibal Directive, which says Israel would rather kill its own people than let them be taken captive by Hamas, because it doesn't want to have to negotiate with Hamas, including on a hostage exchange, because as Omar also mentioned, Israel holds thousands of Palestinian hostages. So Hamas's leverage has been undermined by the fact that Israel, starting on October 7th, when it killed some of its own people, we don't know how many because it's blocked all independent investigations, but they killed at least some of the Israeli victims on October 7th. Another reason why Hamas doesn't have any leverage is that the Arab states have dropped their longstanding demand, their longstanding peace offer, where they offered Israel full normalization if Israel simply accepted the international consensus, which itself is a huge surrender for Palestinians. It would let Palestinians have just 22% of their historic homeland and cede the rest to the Jewish supremacist state that stole it from them. It's called the Arab Peace Initiative, formally offered to Israel in 2002. Netanyahu has long rejected it. The Arab states are no longer even talking about that. They're making side deals with Trump, Qatar giving him a very fancy jet, Saudi Arabia making similar deals. So Hamas's standing is even more undermined by the fact that the people that used to at least stand up for a compromise, a very unjust compromise for Palestinians, are no longer rising to that level.
Dan, very quickly, I've just got a little bit of time left, less than a minute, but you mentioned earlier on that Prime Minister Netanyahu is acting mainly because of pressure from President Donald Trump. How far do you think that pressure is going to go?
So far, it's been proven effective, and the question will remain, about the details of the deal. I cannot right now say without categorically that this would actually happen, but it looks more promising than it did in the recent months and for sure in the last year. So I remain hopeful, and hopefully Trump will be able to bring Netanyahu along for the ride and have him sign the deal.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. To discuss the peace plan and how it was received in Israel, we welcome Alon Pinkas. He is the former Consul General of Israel in New York and joins us from Tel Aviv. Alon, great to have you with us.
Thank you, Anand. Good to be with you.
As I said, this plan is short on detail. It's mainly a framework, an outline, if you like. Some of the details are being worked out right now in these negotiations in Egypt. But looking broadly at the plan, do you think it will work? Is it workable?
I'm very skeptical. You know, on the one hand, Anand, there's a case to be made that these plans should never be too specific. They should not be too elaborate on the details, and the resolution of and timetables should be kept to a minimum. Otherwise, every other day, someone is going to transgress and violate it. On the other hand, there's a case to be made that these broad brush points that are in this 20-point plan are too ambiguous. And since this negotiation is lacking both trust and goodwill, and it is lacking trust and goodwill, I see a 50% chance of the first phase, the hostage release and the prisoner exchange taking place, no more than 50%. But as for the next phases, Israeli withdrawal, Israeli redeployment, an interim Palestinian government, an Arab force with the Palestinian Authority coming in, I see all that under a big question mark. And if that doesn't happen, this invariably means that the war resumes.
Alon, as you say, there is a lack of trust and goodwill. And of course, one of the parties involved in this, Hamas, was not involved in the formulation of the plan at all. But we did hear Hamas say that, look, it's prepared to release all the hostages. That led to President Trump saying, look, he believes that Hamas is serious about peace. And he then ordered the Israelis to stop the bombing of Gaza. In a sense, did that blindside Prime Minister Netanyahu?
In a way, yes. But before getting into that, Anand, just two important things. On Tuesday afternoon, Hamas came up with a new demand in the negotiations in Sinai, in Sharm el-Sheikh in Sinai, and saying that the last hostage will be released only after Israel fully withdraws from Gaza. That obviously is a non-starter, and that points or illuminates to something the Americans somehow overlooked, and that is that both sides, Hamas and Israel, i.e. Mr. Netanyahu, pledged a willingness to negotiate. They did not really pledge a willingness to accept the entire plan. And that leads me to your question, the blindsiding of Mr. Netanyahu. He was cornered by Trump. I mean, he's castigated and ostracized in the world. He tested President Trump's patience too much, and then he went one bridge too far by bombing Qatar on September 9th, which apparently exhausted Mr. Trump's residual patience. And so he cornered him into accepting this publicly, which he did, he being Mr. Netanyahu. He was not blindsided because he saw it coming, but now he's obviously looking for a way out by manipulating and constantly negotiating and hoping, which he may get, his wish, that Hamas actually derail this before he gets a chance to do so.
How will this impact domestic politics in Israel? I'm sure Prime Minister Netanyahu is making the calculation in terms of keeping his coalition together and retaining the support of the Israeli people?
Yeah, well, he doesn't have the support of the Israeli people. 70% in consistent polls show absolute distrust in Netanyahu and want him out and want a peace deal, or not a peace deal, at least a ceasefire and a hostage release. But as for the domestic political implications, there are three scenarios. I'll be very brief. The first is nothing happens. I mean, this is derailed or undermined, and there's no deal, in which case politically he's not impacted in terms of his coalition, but there's a lot of anger building up in the public because there's no deal. Scenario two says that, okay, we go through the first phase, including the hostage release. Israelis are happy, but then nothing happens and the war resumes. That may not really have a long-term effect on his coalition because his coalition want the war to resume. Scenario three, which is the least likely, but perhaps the most desirable for 95% of the world, is that President Trump remains engaged and presses him to keep on. If that happens, then he loses his coalition, and then Israel goes through a process of calling for an election, which is a minimum of 90 days, which then freezes this entire process altogether. So these are the three scenarios. I would not gamble or bet on which one of them is going to happen.
There is one other factor, Alon, and that is how sensitive the Prime Minister is to what we're seeing happen right now internationally. I mean, there's been widespread international condemnation of what many believe is a genocide in Gaza, and recent polls around the world show many people condemning the Israelis for what's happening there. More than half of Australians support sanctions against Israel. Support for Israel in the United States has dropped, and dropped quite a bit, according to polls published here. Does the Prime Minister factor those things into his calculation?
Not at all. I mean, I judge by his actions and by his statements. Not at all. But you have to understand his personality. He revels in this. He relishes this. He thinks that us against the world is a natural phenomenon and a natural state of nature. He believes that he's that he can sell to the public that he's the only one standing up to this biased and tilted and skewed and hypocritical and anti-Semitic world. No, he's not sensitive at all. Look, 155 countries recognized a future Palestinian state. 25 countries, including Israeli allies, and you mentioned some, Australia, Britain, France, Canada, New Zealand, have all condemned Israel and demanded that the war end. Israel is being appealed or petitioned against in the ICJ, in the International Court of Justice. And as you pointed out accurately, Anand, public polls, consistent public polls, in America, in the U.S., show a steep decline in support for Israel, and yet he hasn't moved. The only thing that makes him move, the only thing that influences him, the only thing that he is afraid of is one Donald Trump, which is why I go back to what I said a little earlier in a different context. Whether Trump remains engaged or not is the big question here.
Alon Pinkas, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Anand.
And we need to leave it there. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.